The wind howled across the endless prairie, bending the tall grass like waves in a restless sea. A single rider cut through the golden field, the sun setting behind him in a blaze of orange and red. Dust rose behind the horse's hooves, swirling into the dying light. His name was Eli Carter, a man who'd seen too much of life's rough edges. The war had left him with scars both visible and very deep, and now he was riding west, chasing a promise made long ago, a promise that might be the only good thing he had left. Eli carried little more than a saddlebag, a worn colt, and a folded letter. The paper was creased and yellowed from being opened too often. It was from Clara, the woman he'd loved before the war, the woman who'd told him to come find her when he was done fighting. The frontier's wide open, she had written. I'll be waiting in Redemption Valley, where the land meets the mountains. That letter had been his lifeline during the dark years. But by the time the war ended, the world had changed, and so had he. Still, a promise was a promise, and the West was calling. 3 days' ride brought him to the edge of Redemption Valley. The land stretched wide, and untamed rolling plains giving way to pine ridges and distant blue mountains. A river cut through the valley like a silver snake, and on its banks, a small settlement stood half-built and struggling against the wilderness. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, and the clanging of a blacksmith's hammer carried through the crisp air. Eli slowed his horse, his heart tight in his chest. After all these years, he didn't know what he expected to find. He tied his horse outside the saloon, dusted off his coat, and stepped through the swinging doors. The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Men in worn hats glanced up from their cards, the barkeep froze mid-wipe, and the piano player's fingers hesitated above the keys. Eli nodded to no one in particular and moved to the bar. "Whiskey," he said, his voice rough. The barkeep poured a glass and slid it across. "You new in town?" he asked, studying Eli's sun-beaten face. "Just passing through," Eli said, taking a sip. The barkeep shrugged. "Ain't many pass through Redemption. Either folks come to stay or they get run off." Eli smiled faintly. "Guess I'll see which one I am." He asked quietly, "You know a woman named Clara Hensley?" The barkeep's hand froze on the counter. "Clara. She's out at the Miller place, about a mile upriver. But, you might not like what you find." Eli frowned. "She all right?" The barkeep looked uneasy. "Depends on what you mean by, all right. Her husband was killed last spring. Outlaws hit the Miller ranch hard. She's been running it alone since. Folks say she don't trust nobody these days." Eli felt the weight of those words sink into him. He'd come too late. The years had stolen what might have been, and fate had dealt her a cruel hand. But the promise still burned inside him. He finished his drink, nodded to the barkeep, and rode out toward the river. The Miller place sat on a rise overlooking the valley. The fences were broken, the barn half burned, and a lone figure worked in the fading light, mending a corral post. Eli dismounted and walked slowly forward. She turned when she heard his steps, and for a moment, time stood still. "Clara," he said softly. Her eyes widened, then narrowed in disbelief. "Eli Carter. I thought you were dead." "Not yet," he said, his voice catching. "I came like I said I would." She stared at him for a long time, then looked away. "You're too late, Eli. Everything's gone. My husband, my land, my peace. There's nothing left here worth keeping." He stepped closer. "I made a promise. Maybe I can help you rebuild." She shook her head. "You don't know what this land takes. From people. I've lost plenty," he said. "But I ain't afraid of starting again." Something flickered in her eyes, a mix of anger, grief, and something that might have been hope. But before she could answer, the sound of distant hoofbeats broke the stillness. Clara's face hardened. "Get down," she whispered, grabbing her rifle from the fence. Eli crouched beside her as 4 riders approached, dust rising behind them. The men wore gun belts low on their hips and faces full of trouble. The leader, a tall man with a black hat and a scar across his cheek, pulled up his horse at the gate. "Evenin', Miss Hensley," he called. "Heard you might have got yourself some company." Clara's jaw tightened. "You've got no business here, Tully." "Oh, I think I do," Tully drawled. "You owe me $50 for feed, and I'm here to collect. I told you I'd pay after harvest." He grinned. "Harvest looks a long way off. Maybe I'll just take what you got now." Eli straightened slowly, stepping into view. "You'll do no such thing." Tully's eyes flicked over him, amused. "And who might you be?" "Just a man keeping a promise," Eli said, hand resting on his Colt. The air went tight as a drawn wire. Tully smirked. "You sure you want to die for someone else's debt, stranger?" Eli didn't answer. He watched Tully's hand, waiting for the twitch that meant trouble. It came fast, the glint of metal, the rush of instinct. Eli drew and fired in one motion. The shot echoed off the hills, and Tully fell from his horse, his pistol spinning into the dirt. The other riders froze, eyes wide. Eli's gun stayed steady. "Take your friend and get off this land," he said. "Don't come back." They hesitated only a second before hauling Tully's body and galloping off into the twilight. Silence settled again, broken only by the wind through the grass. Clara lowered her rifle slowly. "You didn't have to do that." Eli holstered his gun. "He wasn't giving me much choice." She looked at him for a long time, something softening in her expression. "You always were stubborn." He smiled faintly. "Guess I still am." They buried Tully by the river at dawn, a shallow grave marked only by a stone. The valley was quiet, the mist rising from the water. Clara stood beside him, arms folded. "More will come," she said. "He ran with a gang. They'll want revenge. Then we'll be ready," Eli replied. She glanced at him. "You really mean to stay?" "I came to keep a promise," he said simply. "Looks like it still stands." Days turned into weeks. Together, they worked the land, mending fences, rebuilding the barn, sowing new seed in the stubborn soil. Eli found a rhythm in the work, something peaceful he hadn't known in years. Clara began to laugh again, sometimes, though the shadows never left her eyes completely. They spoke little of the past, the land demanded too much attention. But in quiet moments, when the stars burned bright over the valley, they shared small pieces of what they'd lost and what they still hoped to find. Then one morning, smoke rose from the ridge. Riders again, 5 this time, hard men with rifles and mean eyes. Clara saw them first and called out to Eli. They took cover behind the corral, guns ready. The gang came fast, led by a man with a red bandana and a sneer. "You kill my brother, old man," he shouted. "You got a death wish." Eli called back. He drew first. "You want to end up the same, come ahead." Gunfire cracked, splinters flying from the fence. Eli returned fire, dropping one rider from his saddle. Clara's rifle barked beside him, and another went down. But they were outnumbered, pinned down. A bullet tore through Eli's shoulder, spinning him to the dirt. Clara dragged him behind a trough, reloading with shaking hands. "Stay with me," she said, voice breaking. He gritted his teeth, blood soaking his sleeve. Ain't going anywhere. The outlaws regrouped, circling the barn. Eli saw what they meant to do before they did it. The leader tossed a torch into the hay. Flames leapt high, wind feeding them. Clara cried out as smoke filled the air. Desperation burned in Eli's chest. He pushed himself up, pain blinding him, and fired again. The leader fell, his torch clattering into the dirt. The others fled, leaving their dead behind. When the smoke cleared, the barn was half gone, and Eli lay pale and still on the ground. Clara knelt beside him, pressing her hand against his wound. "Don't you dare leave me again," she whispered fiercely. He managed a weak smile. Wasn't planning to. The days that followed were slow and quiet. Eli healed, though his arm would never be the same. The valley was peaceful again, for now. The town folk came to help rebuild what was lost, and word spread that the Miller place was safe again, safe because a man named Eli Carter had kept his promise. Summer turned to autumn, the fields golden with grain. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Clara and Eli stood by the river. The water glimmered like fire, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "I used to think this land was cursed," she said softly. "But maybe it just needed someone who wouldn't give up." He looked at her, eyes gentle. "It's the land that makes you keep fighting. It's all we've got left to believe in." She smiled then, the first true smile in years. "So what now?" Eli glanced out across the wide horizon. "Now we build something worth keeping." The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and dust and the promise of rain. Beyond the valley, the frontier stretched on, wild, dangerous, and full of new beginnings. And as the night settled over Redemption Valley, Eli Carter knew that for the first time in a long while, he'd found what he'd been searching for, not the end of the road, but the start of one. The promise had been kept. And in the heart of the untamed West, a new life had begun.